Hello, government students. Today we're doing Notes 3.1, the Presidency. Your essential question: what are the roles and responsibilities of the President? Alright, so first we're going to be covering the President's roles. So there are 8 different roles that the President has to fulfill within their job duties. First is the President is the Chief of State. That means the President is the ceremonial head of the government of the United States. The President is also the Chief Executive, which means ultimately the regulations of executing the law falls upon the President. The President's the Chief Administrator, or like the Director of the government in the United States. And the President is also the Chief Diplomat, which means the President is responsible for all foreign policy, so working with other countries and being the spokesperson on behalf of the United States to the rest of the world. The President is also the Commander-in-Chief, which means the President is in charge of the military. Ultimately, the President makes the highest decisions regarding our military, except for declaring war. Of course, we know that that has to come from Congress. That's an authority given to the legislative branch. The President is the chief legislator, so they can guide legislation. They can request different things be enacted from Congress. They'll give their State of the Union address in which they propose the policies that they want. The President's the chief of party, meaning they are the leader of their political party, whatever political party they may be. And the President is the chief citizen, which means they're a representative of all the people in the United States, not just people of their political party. So these are the last 5 presidents we had. We had Clinton in the 90s, we had Bush in the early 2000s, Obama in the 2010s, of course we know President Trump in 2016, and now our current president, Joe Biden, as of January 20th, 2021. Right, so in order to be president, the Constitution lays out the qualifications. You have to be a natural born citizen, which means you have to be born in the United States or the United States territories. You have to be at least 35 years old, and you have to live in the United States for 14 years. Those are the only 3 requirements. Of course, there are a lot of other qualifications to be president, usually things like political experience, intelligence, character, all of those things are usually considered as well. But the only 3 official requirements are the ones listed here in the Constitution. Until 1951, there was no limit on terms for the president. Most people traditionally had served 2 terms, but this was broken by President FDR. He actually served 4 terms, but every other president traditionally only served 2 because that's what President George Washington did as our first president in the United States. The 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, though, as we know, officially set limits on the presidential terms, so now a president cannot be elected more than 2 times. President Roosevelt was elected in 1932, 36, 40, and 44. He died shortly after being elected in 1944. Congress, just like determining their own salary, also determines the salary of the President of the United States. And it can't be changed during a presidential term. Just like their own sitting salary, they can't change their own sitting salary, but they can change it for the next Congress. They can change it for the next president as well. Currently, presidents get paid $400,000 per year, and they also have a bunch of other benefits as well. So, of course, they get to live in the White House. It's a 132-room mansion. They get to fly around in Air Force One. They get their own private plane. They get a travel account of $100,000. They get an expense allowance, $50,000, $19,000 for entertainment, all kinds of things. They have personal chefs, personal doctors, all the things you can think of. All right, so presidential succession is the plan in which the presidential vacancy can be filled. If we have an opening in the presidential seat, if the president dies or if the president decides to quit, then we have a vacancy and that is filled by the vice president. We all are pretty well aware of that, but the 25th Amendment actually set that line of succession. We have it all the way down 17 people long. Goes to the Vice President and then the Speaker of the House, and then the Leader of the Senate, and then we go to all of the Cabinet Secretaries that were chosen by the President and approved by the Senate. Now, this is the official order, but we've actually never gone past that step number 1 right here, past the Vice President. But we have that line of succession just in case. So the Vice President only actually has 2 jobs. The Vice President has to preside over the Senate. So remember, they're the President of the Senate. Generally, it's pretty a ceremonial role, but they do vote in an event of a tie. So we've already had our new Vice President Harris do this once already. She's only been in office about 3 weeks, but she's already done this. And the other role of the Vice President is the 25th Amendment, so to help decide the question of presidential disability. So they are the ones responsible for telling Congress if the president is no longer able to do their job. So our current president, President Joe Biden, again, just got sworn into office January 20th. And our current vice president is the first ever female vice president, first Indian American vice president, first African American vice president, Kamala Harris. She is a representative from California. So, of course, that 25th Amendment hasn't been used to remove the president from office, but we have had presidents die while in office, and they've been replaced by their successors, their vice presidents. Most recently, JFK was assassinated, and President Johnson took the Oval Office on the airplane actually flying back from Texas. And President Nixon resigned, so he quit the position, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, took office in 1974. Right, so how do we choose the president? The president and vice president are chosen by the Electoral College. So these are a special group of people, the Electoral College, that represent each state in the United States. So these people are called electors in the Electoral College. They're chosen from each state, and they formally select the president and vice president. Now, of course, we started off in the United States, the Federalist and Anti-Federalist. We've pretty much had 2 parties since the beginning of our nation. Those 2 parties have changed over time, but we've pretty much always had a 2-party system in the United States. Originally, when we drafted the Constitution, we decided whoever won the presidential election was going to be the president, and whoever lost, whoever came in second place, was going to be the vice president. But that changed with the election of 1800 between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. It was a pretty nasty campaign. They were really mean to each other, said a lot of negative things about each other, and then were expected to work together after that. So that was changed with the 12th Amendment, and now the president gets to choose who their vice presidential candidate will be, and they run together as a team ticket. The Electoral College chooses the president and the vice president now. Right, so how do presidents get nominated in the first place? In 2020, we had a presidential election, so just last year. We had people running on both sides, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Now, normally when a president is running for re-election, generally the party supports them, but in 2020, we did have one person, one Republican, who was running against President Trump in the primary election. His name was William Weld. Although he did lose the election, he did run against President Trump in order to become the Republican nominee. And then the Democratic nominees, because we didn't have an incumbent, we didn't have someone running for re-election, we had a lot of people running in the Democratic Party to be president. As you can see, Kamala Harris, she was running. She did end up dropping out of the campaign in about March, and then she would go on to be Joe Biden's vice president. Right, so at the end of summer, usually during an election year, they have something called a convention. So conventions are big meetings of each political party. They have delegates from each state that actually vote, based on the Electoral College votes, and they choose who the nominee is going to be officially. Generally, these numbers are whittled down through presidential primaries. So, presidential primaries are elections we have in a presidential election year. Usually, those happen earlier in the year. So, for instance, last year, 2020, we had a presidential election. The primary election happened in March for California, and we got to vote between all the Democratic candidates or all the Republican candidates, depending on which political party you were, and you got to vote for which one you wanted to be the party's nominee to run for office um, in November. Excuse me. So this is where we choose between all of the different candidates, and we express a preference for the presidential nomination. Some states have something called a caucus, where they actually get together and they do a hand vote for whoever they want their nominees to be. Obviously, California is way too big of a state to be able to do something like this. We just do a general election. And then at the end of the summer, they have the National Convention, which the delegates will vote to pick officially the presidential candidate. This is usually the person who's won the elections over the course of the primary elections. So they choose the party's presidential candidate, they come up with a common purpose of their party, and they have their party's platform. So, what are the main things that their party is going to focus on in the upcoming years? So, obviously, we didn't really have conventions in 2020 because of the pandemic. So, here's what a typical convention looks like. 2016 was the last typical conventions we had. So, this was the Democratic National Convention 2016 while they were voting in Hillary Clinton as our first female nominee for the Democratic Party. And then, of course, the Trump election as well. So, he got to be nominated in 2016 from the Republican Party. These are usually places where there's a lot of protests, a lot of people who disagree with those parties. So this is outside of the Democratic National Convention in 1968. And this is outside of the Republican National Convention in 2016. So lots of times protests happen outside of those. So if an incumbent president wants to seek re-election, just like President Trump did, so President Trump was the president, he wanted to run for re-election, usually they always choose that person to be the nominee, just like they did in 2016. The Republican Party chose him to be the nominee. All right, so the Electoral College. When we go to vote, us as individual citizens, we are not actually voting directly for the president. Instead, we're voting for the Electoral College. We're telling the Electoral College who we want them to vote for. So in each state, we get to decide, we get to tell them. So in California, we're telling the electors from California who we want them to vote for. Then the Electoral College makes their vote. They go and they cast their vote. They actually do this in December. They cast their vote, and then they're officially counted on January 6th, which is why there was the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th this year. If no candidate wins a majority of the Electoral College votes, which is 270, then the election actually gets thrown to the House of Representatives. But usually someone always gets 270 Electoral College wins. It is possible to win the popular vote in the presidential election, but lose the Electoral College vote. This has happened 5 times in U.S. history. 5 times that the person who went on to become president did not win the popular vote. It's all about the Electoral College. Nothing requires that electors vote for the candidate favored by the popular vote in their state. And if no candidate wins a majority in the Electoral College, the election is thrown to the House of Representatives. This happened twice. And then each state is given 1 vote in the House of Representatives, which means every state is treated equally, but states with very large populations like California are treated equally to states such as Alaska or Rhode Island that have very, very small populations. So to give you an example, this is the 2016 election, so I can just show you what it looks like. Although Hillary Clinton did win, here she has 65 million votes, and Trump had 62 million votes. She won approximately 3 million more votes than he did, But as you can see, the Electoral College, she only had 232 votes and he had 306 votes because he happened to win the right states. Each state has a number for the Electoral College. They get that number by adding up the House of Representatives plus the Senate. So in California, we have 53 members in the House plus 2 senators, so we have 55 in California. We have the largest because we have the largest population. But so she had to win these specific votes in order to win the states to get to 270. And although she had 3 million more votes, she did not win the right states in order to win the Electoral College. So this kind of shows you Electoral College math. It's not really equal based on population. So in California, for instance, one elector in the Electoral College represents 700,000 people, whereas in Wyoming, one elector represents about 200,000 people because of how many people they have in their state. Now, the 2020 election, we had a very similar outcome. So in the 2020 election, we had Joe Biden win 306, just as Trump won in 2016, 306 Electoral College votes, and Trump won 232. Now, these numbers are flopped as they were in 2016, but Joe Biden ended up winning about 7 million more votes than Donald Trump. So as we can see, you can win more votes. The Democrats won more votes in both elections, but one time they won the election and one time they did not because of the states that they won. Now, you may be looking at this map and saying, hey, there's a lot more red on this map than blue on this map, so how did Joe Biden win? Well, I want you to look at the population as well. So if you look over at this map on the right-hand side, this shows you all the counties by population. Okay, so this shows you where people actually live and how they voted. So a lot of this middle part, yes, is red, but they have very small populations. Whereas in California and up here on the East Coast, they have huge populations here, and those went mostly Democratic. So obviously, the Electoral College system is a little bit flawed. Some people believe we should scrap the Electoral College, that it's not a good system to have. It should go based on popular vote, just like every other thing that we vote for. But some people say that if we do that, then smaller states wouldn't get represented as much. So in most election years, all but 5 elections we've had in the United States, the Electoral College does decide the winner fairly quickly, and generally it goes to the person with the highest vote, the popular vote. Not always, but the majority of the time it does. Sometimes it doesn't, though, and that's why people have a major problem with it. But as of now, the Electoral College is the system that we have in the United States. So that's the end of your notes. Don't forget to write a summary, a couple sentences about what you learned.